The deep space vessel, USV Horizon, had been traveling through the void for 3 weeks when everything went wrong. Captain Cole was sitting in his command chair, drinking his fourth cup of coffee that day, when the ship shuddered violently and the lights flickered. Red warning signals flashed across every console on the bridge, and the familiar hum of the faster-than-light drive turned into a high-pitched whine that made everyone wince. Chief Engineer Lisa Morgan was already running diagnostics before the captain could ask what happened. Her fingers moved quickly across her console, and her face shifted from confusion to concern, and then to something that looked almost like disbelief. She turned to face Captain Cole and told him that they had a serious problem. The navigation system had encountered some kind of gravitational anomaly during the jump. They were no longer anywhere near their intended destination. Commander Brooks, the second-in-command, walked over to the navigation station and looked at the readings himself. He asked Lisa how far off course they were. She took a deep breath and said that according to their instruments, they were approximately 12,000 light-years from where they should be. They had jumped into completely uncharted space. The bridge fell silent for a moment. 12,000 light-years was not a small error. It was the kind of mistake that should have been impossible with modern navigation systems. Captain Cole set down his coffee cup and stood up from his chair. He was a tall man in his early 50s with gray hair at his temples and the kind of calm demeanor that came from decades of service in deep space. He had seen equipment failures before. He had dealt with emergencies that would have broken lesser crews. This was just another problem to solve. He asked Lisa how long it would take to repair the navigation system and calculate a return jump. She said she needed at least 6 hours to run full diagnostics and maybe another 4 to recalibrate everything. The captain nodded and told her to get started. In the meantime, they would take the opportunity to survey their surroundings and gather whatever data they could about this unknown region of space. Communications Officer Stone was the first to notice something strange on her sensors. She reported that she was picking up signals all around them, not natural signals like pulsars or radiation from stars. These were artificial transmissions, thousands of them. The entire region of space was filled with communication traffic. Before anyone could respond to this information, the proximity alarms began to scream. Navigator Chris shouted that they had multiple contacts appearing on sensors. His voice carried an edge of disbelief as he counted them. 10 ships, then 50, then 200. Within minutes, the USV Horizon was surrounded by hundreds of alien vessels, each one larger than anything humanity had ever built. The crew stared at the main in silence. The alien ships were enormous and elegant in a cold, intimidating way. They had smooth hulls that reflected the light of distant stars and weapon arrays that glowed with barely contained energy. The smallest of these vessels was at least 10 times the size of the Horizon. The largest ones were several miles long, floating in space like ancient predators that had never known defeat. Captain Cole studied the alien fleet with a calm expression. He had always known that humanity was not alone in the universe. Scientists had theorized about alien civilizations for centuries, but knowing something intellectually and seeing it with your own eyes were two very different experiences. He asked if she could identify any attempt at communication from the alien vessels, adjusted her equipment, and reported that she was receiving a transmission on multiple frequencies. The aliens were hailing them. She added that the translation software was working on decoding their language, and it seemed like they had some kind of universal communication protocol. Within seconds, the computer had processed enough of the alien language to provide a rough translation. A deep voice filled the bridge, speaking in words that sounded harsh and commanding. The voice identified itself as belonging to High Arbiter of the Dominion. It declared that the human vessel had violated the sacred borders of imperial space. It demanded immediate surrender and complete submission to the eternal authority of the Empire. The bridge crew exchanged glances. Security Chief Gary Palmer rested his hand on his sidearm out of habit. though he knew it would be useless against ships that could destroy them in seconds. Doctor, who had come to the bridge when the alarm started, observed the alien vessels with the detached curiosity of a scientist encountering a new specimen. Captain Cole asked to open a return channel. She nodded and told him he was live. The captain straightened his uniform and addressed the alien fleet. He introduced himself and explained that they were explorers from Earth who had experienced a navigation malfunction. He stated that they meant no disrespect to the Dominion and simply wished to repair their ship and return to their own space. He politely asked if they could receive directions or navigational data that would help them leave territory. There was a long pause before the alien voice responded. High Arbiter seemed confused by the human response. He had expected fear. He had expected begging. He had expected the primitive aliens to prostrate themselves before the might of an empire that had ruled the stars for 12,000 years. Instead, the human captain had asked for directions like a traveler who had taken a wrong turn on a road trip. The Arbiter declared that the humans did not seem to understand their situation. He explained that the Dominion controlled over 40,000 star systems and had conquered hundreds of species. He stated that no vessel entered space without permission, and the punishment for such trespass was death or eternal servitude. Captain Cole listened to this speech with patience. When it was finished, he turned to his crew and asked if anyone was particularly worried. Brooks shrugged and said he had faced worse odds during the mining colony rebellion of 2157. Lisa Morgan mentioned that at least the alien ships looked well-maintained, which suggested they were competent engineers. Gary Palmer commented that the weapon arrays were impressive but seemed designed for fighting ships, not for ground combat, which was interesting. The casual nature of these responses was transmitted to the fleet. High Arbiter found himself in an unfamiliar situation. He had conquered worlds. He had crushed rebellions. He had watched entire species bow before him in terror. But these humans, these strange creatures from an unknown world, were discussing his mighty fleet the way one might discuss the weather. He decided that destruction was too simple. These aliens needed to be studied. They needed to understand their place in the cosmic order. He ordered his fleet to escort the human vessel to the Citadel of Judgment, where all new species were evaluated and processed. Captain Cole thanked him for the escort and asked if there would be refreshments available at their destination. They did not know how to answer that question. As the horizon was guided toward the massive space station in the distance, Stone leaned over to Chris and whispered that she thought the aliens were confused by them. Chris smiled and said that was probably a good thing. Confused enemies made mistakes, and if these wanted to study humanity, they were going to learn some very interesting lessons about the species from Earth. The ship moved forward into the unknown, surrounded by weapons that could vaporize them in an instant, and the crew of the Horizon went about their duties with the quiet confidence of people who had already survived worse things than ancient alien empires. The Citadel of Judgment was the largest structure any human had ever seen. It floated in space like a small moon, covered in towers and docking bays and observation platforms that stretched for miles in every direction. Thousands of ships moved around it constantly, coming and going from ports that could accommodate vessels of every size. They had built this station over 8,000 years ago, and they had expanded it continuously ever since. It served as the central processing facility for all new species that encountered the Dominion. The USV Horizon was guided into a docking bay that seemed designed to make visitors feel small. The ceiling rose hundreds of feet above them, and the walls were covered with images depicting victories throughout history. Alien species of every shape and size were shown bowing before conquerors, their expressions frozen in poses of submission and gratitude. Captain Cole led his senior officers down the boarding ramp and onto the station floor. They were met by a delegation of officials wearing elaborate robes decorated with symbols of their rank. They themselves were impressive beings. They stood nearly 8 feet tall with blue-tinted skin and 4 arms that moved with graceful precision. Their eyes were large and golden, and they regarded the humans with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. An official introduced himself as administrator and explained that the humans would be subjected to a standard evaluation process. Their biological capabilities would be assessed. Their psychological profiles would be analyzed. Their history and culture would be examined. Based on the results, the Dominion would determine whether humanity would be granted the privilege of servitude or simply eliminated as a potential threat. Science Officer Daniel Carter raised his hand and asked what the evaluation process involved specifically. Administrator seemed surprised that a human would dare to ask questions, but he answered anyway. He explained that scientists would conduct physical examinations, environmental tolerance tests, and cognitive assessments. The process typically took several days. Daniel nodded and said that sounded reasonable. He asked if the humans would have access to the data collected during these examinations, as he was personally interested in comparing scientific methods with human approaches. Administrator did not know how to respond to a request for academic collaboration from a species that was supposed to be terrified. The crew was separated into groups for different evaluations. Daniel Carter and several other crew members were taken to a biological research facility deep within the station. The scientists there were eager to study these new creatures from an unknown region of space. They began with standard scans, mapping human anatomy and comparing it to their extensive database of known species. The lead scientist, a named researcher, was initially dismissive of the humans. He expected to find a fragile species that had somehow stumbled into advanced technology. Instead, his scans revealed something deeply troubling. Human bones were denser than those of most intelligent species. Human muscles were capable of generating far more force than their size would suggest. Human immune systems were aggressive and adaptable in ways that seemed almost excessive. Ran additional tests. He exposed human skin samples to various forms of radiation and watched with growing unease as the cells showed remarkable resistance to damage. He analyzed human blood and found it capable of carrying oxygen with unusual efficiency. He examined human nervous systems and discovered that they could process pain in ways that would incapacitate other species. He pulled up the database entry for Earth, which they had downloaded from the Horizon's computers. What he found made him stop and read the information 3 times to make sure he understood it correctly. Earth was classified as a Category 7 death world. The planet featured extreme temperature variations, violent weather patterns, seismic instability, and an ecosystem where nearly every organism had evolved to compete ruthlessly for survival. Predators roamed every environment. Bacteria and viruses constantly mutated to overcome immune defenses. Even the plants had developed toxins and physical defenses against being consumed. Called his colleagues over to look at the data. They gathered around his console and stared at images of Earth's surface. They saw hurricanes that could level cities. They saw deserts where temperatures could kill in hours. They saw oceans filled with creatures that had more teeth than seemed biologically necessary. They saw volcanoes and earthquakes and ice storms and heat waves. One of the junior scientists asked how any intelligent species could have evolved in such an environment, admitted that he did not know. By all logic, a Category 7 death world should only produce primitive organisms locked in eternal cycles of violence and survival. It should not produce creatures capable of building starships. Meanwhile, Doctor was being interviewed in a different section of the station. Her interviewer was a psychologist named Assessor who specialized in understanding the mental structures of new species. Asked to describe human history in broad terms. Thought for a moment and then began to speak. She explained that humans had evolved on a dangerous planet where survival was never guaranteed. They had organized into tribes that competed for resources. These tribes had grown into nations that fought wars over territory and ideology. She mentioned the 2 world wars that had killed tens of millions of people. She described the development of nuclear weapons capable of destroying entire cities in seconds. She talked about pandemics that had swept across continents and famines that had starved entire populations. Assessor listened to this recitation of horrors with increasing disbelief. She asked how humanity had survived all of these catastrophes, smiled and said that humans were stubborn. They kept going even when logic suggested they should give up. They rebuilt after every disaster. They learned from their mistakes, at least sometimes, and they adapted to new challenges. Asked if humans feared death, considered the question carefully before answering. She said that humans certainly preferred to live rather than die, but human culture was filled with stories of people who had sacrificed their lives for others or for causes they believed in. Humans feared many things. They feared failure. They feared being forgotten. They feared living without purpose. Death itself was often seen as preferable to those alternatives. The psychologist stopped recording and simply stared at the human woman sitting across from her. In 12,000 years of evaluating conquered species, she had never encountered a psychology like this. Most intelligent beings developed elaborate mechanisms to avoid thinking about their own mortality. Humans seemed to have integrated death into their worldview so completely that it had lost much of its power over them. Asked if she had said something wrong, replied that she had said something unprecedented. She asked to continue the interview and agreed. Back in the biological research facility, Daniel Carter was chatting with researcher about scientific methodology. He explained how human scientists used controlled experiments and peer review to establish reliable knowledge. Found himself genuinely interested in these explanations despite his growing unease about the species he was studying. Daniel mentioned casually that humans had developed most of their advanced technology within the last few hundred years. They had gone from primitive agriculture to space travel in what recognized as an impossibly short time by galactic standards. That had taken thousands of years to achieve similar progress, and they were considered one of the faster developing species in recorded history. Asked how this rapid advancement was possible, Daniel shrugged and said that humans were good at building on the work of previous generations. They also tended to make their biggest breakthroughs during times of crisis, when the pressure to innovate was highest. War, in particular, had driven many of humanity's technological leaps forward. The researcher made a note in his file. It was a simple observation, but one that carried disturbing implications. A species that innovated fastest when threatened was not a species that could be safely conquered. It was a species that might become more dangerous the harder you pushed against it. He finished his examination and submitted his preliminary report to the station administrators. The humans, he wrote, were far more resilient and capable than their technology suggested. Further evaluation was recommended before any final determination was made. What he did not write, because he did not know how to express it in official language, was that he had spent his entire career studying weaker species and telling the Dominion how to control them. For the first time, he was not sure that control was possible. High Arbiter was not satisfied with the reports he was receiving. The scientific evaluations had raised more questions than they answered, and the humans continued to behave in ways that made no sense to him. They should have been trembling with fear by now. They should have been begging for mercy and offering their unconditional surrender. Instead, they wandered around the citadel of judgment asking questions and making observations as though they were tourists visiting an interesting historical site. He decided that a more direct approach was needed. These humans had clearly not grasped the true power of the Dominion. They needed to see it with their own eyes. They needed to understand that resistance was not merely futile but literally unthinkable against a civilization that had crushed hundreds of species across 40,000 star systems. The Arbiter ordered a demonstration of military supremacy to be arranged immediately. The humans would be shown the might of the Dominion's warriors, the resilience of their soldiers, and the unstoppable force of their greatest warships. By the end of this display, Surely even these strange aliens would recognize their place in the natural order of the galaxy. Captain Cole and his senior officers were escorted to a vast arena built into the heart of the station. The space was large enough to hold thousands of spectators, though today only the humans and their hosts were present. High Arbiter sat on an elevated platform overlooking the arena floor, his four arms resting on the ornate throne that symbolized his authority. The first demonstration involved warriors. A group of 20 soldiers marched into the arena, each one standing over 7 feet tall and wearing ceremonial armor that gleamed under the bright lights. These were members of the Eternal Guard, elite fighters who had been bred and trained for combat over countless generations. They moved with perfect synchronization, their weapons held at precise angles, their expressions cold and focused. The warriors performed a series of combat drills that showcased their speed, strength, and coordination. They sparred with each other using bladed weapons that hummed with energy. They demonstrated their proficiency with ranged weapons by destroying targets that appeared at random intervals around the arena. Every movement was calculated and efficient. Security Chief Gary Palmer watched the demonstration with professional interest. When the warriors finished and stood at attention, asked the humans what they thought of the Dominion's finest soldiers. Gary asked if he could show them something in return. The Arbiter, surprised by the request, granted permission. Gary stepped into the arena and removed his jacket. He was not as tall as the warriors, and he did not have their elegant armor or energy weapons. He was just a middle-aged man with scars on his knuckles and a calm expression on his face. He asked if one of the soldiers would like to spar with him. The warriors looked to their commander for guidance. The commander looked too, who nodded his approval. One of the Eternal Guard stepped forward and took a fighting stance. He clearly expected this to be a brief and one-sided encounter. Gary moved first. His attack was nothing like the precise, choreographed movements of the. It was fast and brutal and efficient in a way that had nothing to do with elegance. He closed the distance before the warrior could react, delivered 3 strikes to vulnerable points in the anatomy, and had his opponent on the ground in less than 4 seconds. The warrior was not seriously injured, but he was completely immobilized and clearly shocked by what had happened. Gary stepped back and explained that on Earth, humans practiced combat sports for recreation. What he had just demonstrated was a combination of techniques from disciplines called boxing, wrestling, and something called. Millions of humans trained in these methods purely for fun and exercise. The remaining warriors shifted uncomfortably. High Arbiter dismissed Gary with a wave of his hand and ordered the next demonstration to begin. The second test involved environmental endurance. They were proud of their ability to withstand harsh conditions, and they had designed a series of chambers that could simulate extreme temperatures, toxic atmospheres, and other hostile environments. These chambers were used to break the will of resistant species and show them that the Dominion could make them suffer in ways they had never imagined. Navigator Chris and 3 other crew members were selected for this demonstration. They were placed in separate chambers and subjected to conditions that they considered extremely unpleasant. The first chamber was heated to temperatures that would cause most species to panic and beg for release within minutes. Chris sat in the heat and waited. After 10 minutes, he knocked on the chamber wall and asked if something was supposed to happen. He mentioned that this was actually cooler than summers in Arizona, the region of Earth where he had grown up. The technicians checked their equipment to make sure it was functioning correctly. It was. Another crew member was placed in a chamber filled with slightly reduced oxygen levels. She sat calmly and practiced breathing exercises that humans used for relaxation. When asked how she felt, she said she had experienced worse conditions during mountain climbing expeditions on Earth. The third crew member was subjected to minor electrical shocks designed to cause discomfort without permanent damage. He winced at each shock but remained composed throughout. He explained afterward that he had once been struck by lightning during a storm and survived. so this was really not that impressive by comparison. High Arbiter was beginning to feel something unfamiliar. It took him a moment to identify the emotion because he had not experienced it in centuries. It was frustration. He ordered the final demonstration to proceed. This would surely impress the humans. Nothing impressed new species more than the Dominion's greatest warship. The viewing platform was repositioned to face a massive window that looked out into space. There, floating majestically against the stars, was the pride of the fleet. The Eternal Judgment was a dreadnought 3 miles long, bristling with weapons capable of destroying planets. Its hull was armored with materials that could withstand almost any attack. Its engines could propel it across the galaxy at speeds that seemed impossible for something so massive. Spoke with obvious pride as he described the vessel. He explained that it had taken 200 years to build and required a crew of 50,000. It could glass the surface of a world in hours and had never been defeated in combat. This single ship represented the pinnacle of engineering and military power. Captain Cole studied the massive vessel through the window. He nodded appreciatively and admitted that it was certainly impressive. Then he asked a question that seemed innocent but carried unexpected weight. He asked how long they had possessed faster-than-light travel. Answered that the Dominion had mastered such technology approximately 15,000 years ago. Cole nodded again and mentioned that humans had achieved faster-than-light travel only about 150 years ago. Before that, they had been confined to a single planet. In fact, roughly 400 years ago, humans had still been using wooden ships powered by wind to cross their oceans. The implication hung in the air. They had needed to reach their current level of advancement. Humans had gone from sailing ships to starships in 4 centuries. They had developed nuclear weapons within a few decades of discovering the relevant physics. They had landed on their moon less than 70 years after their first powered flight. Asked what this had to do with anything, Cole smiled slightly and said he was just making conversation. But the officials around the Arbiter were exchanging glances. They understood what the human was suggesting. A species that advanced this quickly when left alone might become truly dangerous if given a reason to focus its innovative energy on military applications. The demonstration ended without the desired effect. The humans had seen the might of the Dominion, and they had responded with polite interest rather than terror. High Arbiter dismissed them back to their quarters and sat alone on his throne, thinking about what he had witnessed. For the first time in his very long life, he wondered if they had made a mistake in bringing these creatures to the Citadel, instead of simply destroying them when they had the chance. Word spread quickly through the Citadel of Judgment. The station housed thousands of officials, scientists, soldiers, and workers, and news traveled among them like fire through dry grass. There were also representatives from dozens of subject species present, aliens who had been conquered generations ago and now served the Dominion in various capacities. These servants heard the whispers and passed them along to others. The humans had not bowed. The humans had not begged. The humans had watched the mightiest warriors of the Eternal Guard and responded with casual demonstrations of their own combat abilities. The humans had sat in torture chambers designed to break spirits and complained that the conditions were not harsh enough. The humans had looked upon the greatest warship ever constructed and asked questions about how long it took to build. For species that had known nothing but submission for centuries, these stories were revolutionary. A small reptilian species that had been conquered 8,000 years ago gathered in their cramped quarters and discussed what they had heard. A race that served as laborers throughout the station clicked their mandibles in quiet conversations during their work shifts. The elegant beings with silver skin who had once ruled a small empire of their own before the Dominion absorbed them listened to the reports with expressions that their masters might have recognized as hope. High Arbiter was aware that something was changing. He could feel it in the way the station's atmosphere had shifted. Subject species that normally kept their eyes down were occasionally glancing up. Conversations stopped when officials walked past. There was an electricity in the air that had not been there before. He convened an emergency meeting of the station's senior administrators to discuss the situation. Researcher presented his biological findings, explaining that humans were far more physically capable than their appearance suggested. Assessor described the disturbing psychology she had uncovered during her interviews. The military commanders reported on the failed demonstrations and the unsettling questions Captain Cole had asked about technological development timelines. Listened to all of this and came to a decision. The humans were too dangerous to keep alive. They were clearly some kind of anomaly, a species that had somehow evolved wrong and developed capabilities that should not exist. Their very presence was destabilizing the carefully maintained order of the Citadel. They needed to be destroyed, and all records of their existence needed to be suppressed. Administrator raised a concern. He pointed out that too many people had already seen the humans and heard stories about them. Destroying the aliens now would only create martyrs. The subject species would remember the creatures who had not been afraid, and that memory might be more dangerous than the humans themselves. Before could respond, another voice spoke up. It belonged to a junior officer named who had been assigned to monitor the human crew during their time on the station. She was young by standards, barely 300 years old, and had spent most of her career following orders without question. But something about the humans had affected her in ways she did not fully understand. Suggested that perhaps the humans were not the threat. Perhaps the threat was the Dominion's inability to understand them. She had observed the humans closely over the past several days. She had watched how they interacted with each other, how they responded to challenges, how they maintained their composure in the face of overwhelming power. They were not fearless because they were stupid or because they did not understand the danger. They were not afraid because they had learned, through countless generations of struggle on their hostile world, that fear was a luxury they could not afford. Dismissed her comments as the naive observations of an inexperienced officer. He ordered the council to prepare for the elimination of the human vessel and its crew. The execution would take place the following day. Left the council chamber with a troubled mind. She made her way through the station's corridors until she reached the section where the humans were being held. The guards recognized her authorization and let her pass. She found Lieutenant Maria Santos sitting alone in one of the common areas, reading something on a portable device. Maria looked up as approached. She smiled in a way that seemed genuine and welcoming, which was not how conquered species usually responded to their overseers. She asked if had come to conduct more interviews or tests. Sat down across from the human woman and admitted that she had come to ask questions, but not official ones. She wanted to understand something that had been bothering her since she first began observing the humans. How did they maintain hope? How did they face situations that seemed impossible and continue moving forward? They had conquered hundreds of species, and all of them had eventually broken. All of them had accepted that resistance was pointless. But the humans acted as though surrender had never occurred to them as an option. Maria considered the question for a long moment before answering. She explained that humans had a complicated relationship with the universe. They knew that the cosmos was vast and indifferent to their existence. They knew that their planet was a tiny speck of rock orbiting an unremarkable star in an average galaxy among billions of galaxies. They knew that their individual lives were brief, and their species might eventually go extinct like countless others had before them. But knowing all of this, humans had decided to matter anyway. They had decided that the universe's indifference was not a reason to give up but a reason to try harder. If nothing they did would be remembered in 1 billion years, then they would make the most of the time they had. If the odds were against them, they would beat the odds or die trying. This was not logical. This was not reasonable, but it was human. Asked how a species could develop such a philosophy, Maria smiled and said that humans had not developed it on purpose. It had emerged from their history, from countless generations of ancestors who had faced extinction and refused to accept it. Humans were the descendants of survivors, and survival had become part of their identity in ways they did not always consciously recognize. The officer sat in silence, processing what she had heard. She understood now why the humans were so dangerous to the Dominion. It was not their physical capabilities or their rapid technological development or their unusual psychology. It was the idea they represented. The idea that an ancient empire built on submission and fear might not be as eternal as it claimed to be. Made a decision that would have been considered treason if anyone had known about it. She told Maria that the council had ordered the humans to be destroyed. The execution was scheduled for the following day. She did not know what the humans could do with this information, but she felt they deserved to know. Maria thanked her for the warning and asked why was telling her this. The officer thought about the question and realized she did not have a good answer. She simply said that perhaps it was time for things to change. She left the human quarters and returned to her duties, wondering if she had just made the biggest mistake of her life or taken the first step toward something better. Meanwhile, in the engineering section of the USV Horizon, Chief Engineer Lisa Morgan finished the last of her repairs. The navigation system was fully operational. She contacted Captain Cole on a secure channel and reported that they could leave whenever he gave the order. The captain thanked her and said they would discuss it soon. He had a feeling things were about to get interesting. He was right. Captain Cole gathered his senior officers in the conference room of the USV Horizon that evening. The ship was still docked in the Citadel of Judgment, surrounded by hundreds of warships, but the mood among the crew was surprisingly calm. They had faced death before in various forms, and they had learned that panic never improved the odds of survival. Lieutenant Maria Santos reported what she had learned from. The council had decided to destroy them. The execution was scheduled for the following morning. They had perhaps 12 hours before the Empire's forces came for them. Commander Brooks asked what their options were. Lisa Morgan explained that the navigation system was fully repaired and they could attempt an emergency jump back to human space. The problem was that they would detect their preparations and likely destroy them before they could complete the jump sequence. The Horizon was fast for a human ship, but it could not outrun the weapons of an ancient empire. Science officer Daniel Carter suggested a different approach. He had been studying the communication systems during their time on the station. He believed he could broadcast a message that would be heard not just by but by all the subject species present on the Citadel. If the humans were going to die, they could at least leave something behind. Captain Cole considered this proposal. He asked what kind of message Daniel had in mind. The science officer said he was thinking about the truth. The simple, straightforward truth about what humanity was and what they believed. It might not save the crew of the Horizon, but it might plant seeds that would grow long after they were gone. The captain made his decision. He told the crew to prepare for departure at first light. They would broadcast Daniel's message during the jump sequence. Whether they escaped or not, the galaxy would remember that humans had been here. The night passed slowly. Some crew members slept while others could not. They talked quietly among themselves about their homes on Earth and the lives they might never return to. They wrote messages to loved ones that might never be delivered. They did not complain or despair. They simply prepared for whatever was coming. As the artificial morning arrived on the station, High Arbiter assembled his forces. Hundreds of soldiers surrounded the docking bay where the Horizon was held. Weapons platforms were positioned to prevent any escape attempt. The Eternal Judgment itself had moved into position to deliver the killing blow if necessary. They were taking no chances with these strange aliens. Broadcast an ultimatum to the human vessel. He gave them one final opportunity to surrender and accept judgment. If he promised their deaths would be quick. If they resisted, their suffering would be legendary. Captain Cole's voice came through the communication system in response. He thanked the Arbiter for the offer, but explained that humanity would have to decline. He said that humans had a saying on their world. It went something like this: "It was better to die on your feet than to live on your knees." He apologized if that seemed rude, but it was simply how humans were built. Then Daniel Carter activated his broadcast. The message went out on every frequency the station used. It reached the command centers and the quarters of the subject species and the ships floating in space around the Citadel. It was translated automatically into dozens of languages, and everyone who heard it stopped what they were doing to listen. The message was simple. Daniel identified himself and his species. He explained that humans came from a world that tried to kill them every day of their existence. They had survived ice ages and plagues and wars and disasters. They had crawled out of caves and crossed oceans and reached for the stars. They had done all of this not because anyone gave them permission or because destiny demanded it. They had done it because they refused to give up. He said that every species in the galaxy had the same potential. Every being that could think and dream and hope had the same spark inside them that had driven humanity forward. The Dominion wanted the galaxy to believe that submission was the natural order, that the strong ruled and the weak served forever. But that was a lie. The natural order was change. The natural order was growth. The natural order was the endless struggle of life against everything that tried to destroy it. He ended the message with a statement that would be remembered long after the events of that day. He said that humanity was not impressed by the Dominion, not because humans were better or stronger or smarter, but because humans understood something that they had forgotten. Empires fell. Always. Every single one throughout history had eventually crumbled. The only question was what would rise in their place. The broadcast ended. For a moment, the entire station was silent. Then Captain Cole gave the order to jump. Lisa Morgan activated the faster-than-light drive, and the engines of the Horizon began to glow with building energy. They opened fire, but something unexpected happened. Several of the weapon platforms failed to discharge. Someone had sabotaged them during the night. Security footage would later show a young officer named moving through restricted areas in the hours before dawn. The Horizon shuddered under the impacts it did receive, but the shields held long enough. The jump drive reached full power, and space itself seemed to fold around the small human vessel. In a flash of light that would be described in records for generations to come, the humans vanished. They reappeared 12,000 light-years away in familiar space near the edge of human territory. The ship was damaged but intact. The crew was alive. Against all odds, they had escaped. Communications Officer Stone was the first to pick up the signal. It was faint and had traveled an unimaginable distance, but it was unmistakably a message from. The young officer had found a way to transmit across the vast gulf of space between them. Her message was brief. She said that things were changing on the Citadel. The subject species had heard Daniel's broadcast. They were talking among themselves in ways they had never talked before. The Dominion was trying to suppress the recording, but it was spreading faster than they could contain it. She ended the message with two words that would later become famous among both humans and the species of the Dominion. She simply said, "Thank you." Captain Cole ordered the ship to proceed to the nearest for repairs and debriefing. He knew that humanity would need to prepare for what was coming. They would not forget what had happened. They might send fleets. They might declare war. They might try to destroy the species that had embarrassed them in front of their subjects. But as he looked around at his crew, at these ordinary humans who had faced an ancient empire and refused to kneel, he felt something he had not expected. He felt proud, not just of his crew, but of his entire species. Humanity had stumbled into something much bigger than themselves, and they had responded exactly as humans always did. They had shrugged and asked for directions and made jokes about the weather. They had wanted to impress them. They had wanted to inspire fear and submission and awe. Instead, they had encountered a species that looked upon 12,000 years of galactic dominance and simply was not impressed. And somehow, in ways that would take decades to fully understand, that lack of impression had changed everything. The USV Horizon limped home through the stars, carrying with it the first chapter of a story that would reshape the galaxy. Behind them, an empire that had never known doubt began to question itself for the first time. And across thousands of worlds, species that had forgotten what hope felt like started to remember. Humanity had arrived on the galactic stage. They had not meant to. They had not been prepared for it. But now that they were here, they had no intention of leaving quietly. The universe would simply have to adjust.